You got to operate in truth, right? Operate in truth. Tell the truth.
Hello, everybody, and welcome to the Gator Truth Florida Football Podcast. I'm Daniel, and this will be a different type of episode for the podcast. This episode of the podcast, I'm going to talk about my fandom with the Gators, my family's history with the Gators, and generally, a lot of this comes from a question I received a few weeks ago, which was there any particular game that made you a fan of the Gators? And also, in part, I had an idea months ago when I first started this podcast about how I'd like to talk to other Gator fans about their fandom and definitely make that either part of this podcast or part of a sister podcast that does not yet exist. So, on this episode, I'm going to test that out. I'm going to let you know a little about myself, tell some stories. I would love to hear from you and some of your stories, and maybe we can discuss it on the podcast at some point. What I can tell you about my family's story with the Gators, I can go back to roughly about 1948. I don't know if it starts a little before then, but I do know by then I have a copy of a Gator Walk brick that was done when they started the Gator Walk back in 2005 that I have on my shelf in the house that has my grandfather's name. And it says Loyal Gator since 1948. So that's about the time I could say that he got involved. Maybe he got involved earlier, and 48 is when he started getting season tickets. I'm not entirely sure of which one those are, but I can say that the brick does list 1948 as the Loyal Gator since year. So we're going to go ahead and use that just as a framework. I'll say around that time, I do know he started going to games. At some point, he did end up with his business partner getting season tickets. Our family still has those tickets, and those tickets are still with his business partner's family. So we see them, and it's one of just the interesting traditions. I know if any of you have had season tickets or do have season tickets, you know that the people you sit around are special. In some ways, this is also special for our family because these are families that have grown up together and been together for the decades. And really, the only time we see each other is during the football season. And I know you guys listening out there probably have those people in your life, for those people that you go over to their house and watch the games, wherever you may be watching the games from, and have your own special traditions. And that's part of what I want to get into with this episode and possibly future episodes with other Gator fans like yourself, wherever you may be. Because the one thing we can say that unites us is that we are Gator fans, and we have our own special traditions outside of that. We have our own, here's where we tailgate, or who's here we hang out with, and things like that. Well, moving on from around the time my grandfather gets tickets, my dad ends up in the 1960s hanging out at the University of Florida with his first wife. He told me a story one time where it was around the Spurrier era. I can't tell you the exact year it was, but he and a few guys had a friend that was on the football team. He said a tight end, or I remember him saying a tight end, who would sometimes let them into practice. Whether that's a tall tale or not, I don't know, but it's a pretty interesting one to know that, back in the 60s, we were still a little bit tight on the practice. And here my dad was someone allegedly being let in to watch the practices. And then my mom grows up going to games, tailgating with my grandfather. And in 1976, she ends up going to UF to study journalism. And I hope to have her on one of these episodes to talk about things that she experienced growing up. I don't want to tell too many of her stories because I think that'd be also just a fun thing to do. So as I talked about before the LSU game, my first game, I was 5 years old, go to LSU 1992. We talked about is a 28-21 Florida victory. And I can't really say that there's any one game that made me a Gator. I wouldn't be surprised if my first words were "Go Gators." We have pictures of me in the little Gator outfit. We're talking with the little plastic helmet from the time I could walk. So just a lot of growing up Gators, orange and blue everywhere. And then finally, 5 years old, I start kindergarten, and my first game is the Florida LSU game. So if I wasn't hooked before that, I definitely was hooked then. So I thought as I was formatting, writing out what I wanted to do with the episode, I'd go through a few of my favorite games and also just a few stories from those games. And the first one I've got written down that I really truly remember. I mean, there were other games I could talk about, like the 93 Mississippi State game that I have some memories of, 93 FSU, which was first loss I experienced. But the thing I'd really say, first really big memory outside of those games, like the first LSU game or hearing about Auburn, or the first Louisville game, which was the first homecoming game I experienced, which is why I will not eat queso to this day, but that's a whole different story. I could talk about those, but the first really big one I remember is that 95 Tennessee game, which many people remember that for Lawrence Wright's all-time hit on Joey Kent in that game severed his tongue. But for me, what I remember is it's one of the very first rain games I experienced. Well, my first few were 93 Georgia, 94 Georgia, which I remember those. And definitely were wet games, got all sorts of stories from those. But I remember us being down, and I remember this big comeback that we had, which watched the game. I think we ended up winning it 62-37. And we come back, and it becomes a torrential downpour. And a few of the core memories I have are just playing in the water as watching the team go, because where we had seats right in the corner, the northwest corner of the stadium, and we just had a gushing bit of water coming down on us. So I got a cup and just started tossing water in the air because I'm 8 years old, and what else you gonna do during the breaks? But I remember that, and I also remember after the game, we were parking out at Flavet Field, and some of the Tennessee band was getting on their bus outside the O'Connell Center. And I think this is kind of a jerk thing now, but at the time I was just being a nice kid, and I said, "Well, you guys sounded good today." And of course, the Tennessee band guy that I said it to didn't look too happy. Again, looking back, that's kind of a jerk move, but at the time, I really did it with the best of intentions. But those are two core memories I have early on. Definitely the 97 FSU game, which I can say is the loudest I've ever heard the stadium when we got that game sealing interception. That by far is the loudest I've ever heard that stadium, in my opinion. And I've been there for most every moment where someone said that's the loudest I've ever heard it. And that's just my opinion on that. But a funny story in the family from that 97 FSU game is we go down, and right before we got, the big pass to Quezzy, then the touchdown run by Taylor, my FSU scores, my grandfather gets frustrated, and he just leaves. Like, he's tired of it. He's seen this play out before. He's not going to be in the stadium when we lose to FSU, walks to Flavet Field, listens to the rest of the game on the radio. And of course, he doesn't really have the car on. He's just got the electricity on. And so, of course, we come back, we win the game. Now, I don't know he's left the game because I'm in seats now in like section 24, I believe, at the north end of the stadium. And so I wasn't sitting with him in the main seats. And so he's left, and I really had not heard the story until his funeral. So he leaves the game, walks to Flavet Field, turns on the electricity in the car to listen to the rest of the game. Well, and then we come back, we win. We get to the car. Well, he's killed the battery. Now, my grandfather, great guy, but this is something that usually would send him over the edge. The thing is, he was so happy we beat FSU in that situation, one of the top teams in the nation, and we beat them twice in a calendar year. How many times can you say you did that to a rival? And he's so happy about it. It was just, okay, well, the car ran out of battery. So that's one of those just fun memories. And I know there's plenty of Gator fans like him that get into games and are just like, well, forget this. And this is a guy who, had been going for at that point for 50 years. And I'm not at all going to question his fanhood. I mean, we all get frustrated at some point with things. This was just after 50 years, his breaking point, thinking we're about to blow a game to FSU, and we end up having one of the greatest victories ever. Hanging in my living room is a poster he bought from that game that says "In Your Face," and it's a picture of their FSU's quarterback being tackled, and that's on my wall. To be honest, we didn't find that poster. He didn't ever hang it. We didn't find it until after he passed. But when we did find it, I said, I've got to have that. I've got to put that up. And that kind of ties in a little bit into something else that we used to do all the time. In the Spur era, we're blowing teams out a lot. And due to us blowing teams out a lot, we would leave 5 minutes early from every game. It wasn't something I really thought was anything unusual until later on, and now I stay till the end of most games. If you look on my phone, some of our worst losses, like Georgia last year or the 2014 Missouri game, I have pictures that I took at the 0-0-0 mark just to say, hey, I was here till the end, so I can say that I've seen some of the worst of Gator football and that I stayed through it. Now, can I say I've stayed through every game throughout the years? Absolutely not. But some other big games, I remember the 1999 Tennessee game. It was a very unique game. Not that we never got loud before, but for some reason, that's a game where getting really loud on defense really clicked for myself and my brother. My grandfather used to take seat cushions to the games, and that's when we got the seat cushions out and started drumming on them the entire time we're on defense. And of course, Alex Brown has such a phenomenal game that game, and just one of the legendary performances in Florida history. And it's a game that sticks out to me for multiple reasons, including that drumming on the seat cushions. So, it's the weird things that always spark memories about Gator football. And I'm sure you probably have one as well. Maybe it's something that you have at a tailgate. Maybe it's, Cracker Jacks, kind of like how I have my queso issue, or, anything like that. Florida football is definitely something fun, and it's fun to hear, at least to me, hearing other people and what their experiences and what triggers them, especially if it's something weird like me and these seat cushions and talking about the 99 game. And one thing I can say about my grandfather, again, started going to games around 1948, loyal Gator since 1948, is at the age of 86 years old. He and his second wife, after my grandmother had passed, he got remarried, drove to Knoxville at 86 to go to the 2002 Tennessee game. And if you don't know what that game is, or if you do and maybe not remember, or maybe you completely remember this game, it was pouring in Knoxville, almost like the 95 game I talked about earlier in Gainesville. Well, it's pouring in Knoxville, so he driven all the way up to Knoxville, decides, I'm not going to the game. And his business partner's daughter, who still goes to games, and I actually hope to have her on at some point, very, very interesting woman, goes over to my grandfather's hotel room there in Knoxville, and they watch the game on the TV. In Knoxville, they've all driven up from Florida, and they all watch the game on TV. I just think it's impressive that at 86, he's driving to Knoxville for a Florida game, which I'm sure most of us would be happy to make it to 86, much less being able to drive to a Gator game several hours away, several states away. So definitely a fun story there. I also have talked about in the past another game that had some fun influence on me. The first one of the first road games, the first road win I experienced, which was the '04 FSU game, which of course is the Ron Zook Field game. As most Gator fans know, that's the night they dedicated the field to Bobby Bowden. Ron Zook in his last stand at Florida beats Bobby Bowden, gets carried off the field. I was right there in front of me. I talked about this game on a prior episode on one of the Q&A segments. Definitely check that out because I'm not going to go into long form today. And then moving forward to the Urban Meyer era, the '06 Bama game, my grandfather had not really gone to many games at the Swamp for the previous few years, but at 90 years old, he circled that game since it was the celebration of 100 years of Gator football. At that point, again, loyal Gator, 58 years at that point, age of 90 and this ended up being his last game in the Swamp. And I'm not sure you could ask for a better last game. Many of you may remember that game, but some of you listeners may be too young, or maybe 16 years ago is just not that great of a memory. But it was a back and forth game, Florida wearing throwback uniforms for the first time. And Chris Leak busts a long run, back and forth game. John Parker Wilson having a decent game. I remember it for the guy in front of me keep saying, "Go, John Parker, go, John Parker." And just all sorts of craziness. Well, near the end of the game, Reggie Nelson seals it with a major pick six, returning it to the north end zone. At this time, our seats that aren't in the main family seats are up in Sunshine Terrace 324, which was really great for the Urban Meyer years, being able to see the spreads and see the play development from up there. And of course, it was a hot 3:30 game, but whatever. It was great watching him run right at us, dodges several defenders. Look it up on YouTube if you don't remember the play. But just a phenomenal, great game against what, even at that time, it was the perennial program. If you go throughout the whole history of the SEC, they're the big bad. And for my grandfather's last game in the Swamp to be against a team that really had ran the SEC the entire time he had been watching the Gators, and that even includes going back and forth with them in some SEC title games in the 90s when we kind of took a few games winning streak. And of course, 99, our big home winning streak is snapped by Alabama. So to have that victory over a program like that, that's just something that's really kind of awesome to think about. And then, of course, another big game that I got to witness and is still really cool to think about being there was the '06 Carolina game. Jarvis Moss, of course, blocking the field goal at the end to send us to the SEC championship and eventually the national championship. In fact, outside of Section 9, where our family main seats are, there is a mural that has the picture of him blocking that kick. So definitely a good influence. And I would say that moment is a top 3 loudest moment in the Swamp, in my opinion. And then '07, the Tennessee game, which was Tim Tebow's coming out party. I remember that for just being fun, where it was sit back and relax against a team that we had been close with my entire life, minus a game or two. Definitely at that time, we had been going back and forth. The '06 game was a 1-point win. '05, we had done a little bit better, but they had beaten us in '01, '03, '04. But this was just a runaway win. Lots of fun. Definitely look up the highlights on YouTube if you're not familiar with the game, or if you just want to remember some great days. That is when Cam Newton came in and ran over the Tennessee defender. Of course, '08 LSU, big night game in the Swamp, end up killing LSU. One of the last times we'd ever do that. It was fun from the beginning when Harvin catches the bomb all the way through the end. I do believe it was about 52-20. I didn't look up the score before doing this. And then in recent years, getting to see games like the 2015, Tennessee game where it's 4th and 14, Greer hits Callaway, and the great block by Powell. Callaway goes down the sidelines, and then we needed Tennessee to miss the same kick twice, even when they moved the ball on the second kick further inside from the hash, which was definitely an officiating error. And I remember lots of people leaving the game because they thought there's no way we're coming back. You can actually see it on the highlights. There are tons of gaps in the seats, which is why that moment for me is not up there with the loudest moments in the swamp, because so many people had left. But still a great fun game. And I also remember thinking, we got asked if we wanted to go out to eat by my aunt after the game. And I really was like, I don't know. I mean, and this was while we were losing. I was kind of frustrated. Of course, we end up winning that game. I'm like, heck yes, let's go out to eat. And I believe it was Trip Thurman, one of the linemen at the time, comes into the restaurant, after we're there and eating, comes in with his family and gets a major ovation because here's a Gator player and good for you kid. And it was also great being my first year at UF in law school and first major game, and we have a game like that. And then, of course, 2017 Tennessee, which was a lot of fun. The heave to cleave, which I know my wife can verify. I'm not sure if my brother can. I said right before the play, and there are people, we were in section 13, our extra seats had moved to 13 at the time. I know there's at least one guy who was in 13 that heard it because he said it afterwards. I said, if it were up to me, I'd throw it to Cleveland. Now, what I was talking about is a quick shot to Cleveland, gets in a field goal range with 1 second left. Obviously, it was a different type of throw to Cleveland, but still one of the greatest endings to a game at Florida Field history. Definitely nuts. Something you don't forget. One of the few times I've ever seen a Hail Mary. Wish I would have seen, and I know there's debate whether it's a Hail Mary or not. I'm going to use that just for the colloquial use of it. And then would have loved to see that again in Knoxville this year. Almost had the chance. And then 2019 Auburn, again, that P-Ride run, that is probably a top 5 loudest moment I've ever heard in the swamp. And so many other great games and throughout the years. Obviously, 2020, for the most part, at home was a fun year, except for that closer against LSU. There were fun games in the Muschamp era at times, such as the South Carolina game where we really blew them out. But with that said, there's been good games, there's been bad games, but luckily I've been blessed to see the Gators both home and away. One of my crazy Gator stories is the Peach Bowl after the 2018 season. My wife and I got plane tickets, hopped on a Spirit flight at like 7 in the morning, flew up to Atlanta, took the MARTA into downtown, got off at about the stadium, went, got breakfast, and then hung out, went to the game, which kicked off at noon, I believe. Go to the game afterwards. And I used to, when they had paper tickets everywhere, I used to collect ticket stubs. I've got a whole collection from the 90s until this game about. And I remember after the game, all I wanted was to get a ticket stub because I'd been to all the Florida Michigan games. They had gone against us, and I just wanted one from the one we won, and couldn't find anyone who had one or anyone that wanted to even sell it for a small amount. And then we end up at Twin Smokers Barbecue, which is not far from the stadium there. And the funny thing is, everyone wants to eat inside. Well, I'd been there before. I knew there's an outdoor patio. We say, we'll eat outdoors, get seated immediately. Now we're at a bigger table than 2 of us need. And I see this family come up, about 7, 8 people. 4 of them were kids. And I just waved them down. I'm like, you can sit here. And so if you're listening, I remember asking for a ticket stub. I know this sounds ridiculous. Why are you talking about ticket stubs? Because, Gators, we have interesting things. One of mine was ticket stubs. And I remember the wife was kind of like, what? And the husband, or one of the husbands, says to his wife, like, he helped us get a table. He's letting us sit with him. we're not going to do anything with the ticket stub. Just go and give it to them. So I happen to have one from that game. And then after that, after we're done eating, we get up, we leave, hop on the MARTA, go back to the airport, and we fly back to Orlando that night. So we did a whole day trip to Atlanta just for the Peach Bowl, but it was such a fun time. And there's lots of other craziness. I met up with a few of my friends from GatorChatter.com, definitely giving them a shout out. All sorts of just good times going on that day and many days since, many days before. You'll notice I've not talked about any Florida Georgia games. That's a whole episode in and of itself, just talking about what interesting stories. And I've got interesting stories from 93, which is the timeout game. If you don't know what I'm talking about, as I've said with many of these games, YouTube it. 94, the only time Georgia's played at UF in the modern era. 96 in the rain. I definitely have stories. I believe it's 99 or 2000. It involves cotton candy. And maybe as we get to the Georgia game next week, I'll share some of these. Maybe we'll continue on. Also, of course, there's some fun things about the 08 game, 2010 game. There are things that I'm not necessarily proud of, but they're still fun. And of course, I got to talk about the time Fred Taylor kept me from getting Gator merch. Yes, that is true. Fred Taylor did keep me from Gator merch, and I'll explain how that happened on a future episode. But for now, if you've made it this far, thank you so much for listening. Please share our videos, or not our videos. Well, hopefully one day we'll have videos. We do have a few small ones, which I need to upload a few more on our YouTube page. Just little things from game day. There's some Gator walks, some flyover, or maybe that was just on Twitter, but also Gator entrances. I need to upload, if it hasn't, Mick Hubert as the Mr. Two Bits. But we're trying to get more content on the YouTube. But please share the podcast with a friend. Thank you, everyone who has shared it, continues to share it. And once again, reach out to me. I'd love to make an episode talking to you about your fandom, whether it's here during the season or when we're in the dead zone where there are no games. I won't say it's the off season, as Josh Pate says on his podcast. There really is no off season. That's a way to know that a person is a casual. But we'll talk about it as the season without games and how will we get through that. Well, I'd love to hear some of your family history with the Gators. Some of your stories about, hey, I was at a Gator game and this awesome thing happened. And I would love to hear that. Or here's a memory I have with my dad or my mom or my grandfather or my friends at a Gator game. Lots of good stuff that I hope to talk to you about moving forward. Thank you again for listening, as this is a totally different episode. I didn't want to talk about anything current today. There's a lot of mixed emotions in Gator Nation right now, and I just want to offer something different. Hopefully some of it's been fun for you. Hopefully it's jogged memories maybe that you didn't remember until you thought, oh, I remember this game against Tennessee or this game against FSU, or oh, this was a great memory that came up because you said something and it just randomly triggered me, like seat cushions. I don't know. But again, thank you for listening. And as always, go Gators.